The chamber was enormous. It stretched so far in every direction that the far walls were hidden behind a soft blue haze. Thousands of seats rose in curved rows all the way up to the high ceiling, and in those seats sat beings of every shape and size. Some had 4 arms, some had no eyes. Some breathed through slits in their necks and sat behind glass panels filled with yellow gas. The chamber smelled of 100 different worlds: sharp chemicals, sweet rot, burning metal, all mixed together into something that had no name. This was the Galactic Conclave, the oldest governing body in the known universe. It had been meeting in the same location for over 6,000 years. Wars had been stopped here. Treaties had been signed here. Species had been welcomed here, and species had been expelled here. It was not a perfect place. But it was the only place where 212 civilizations could sit in the same room without killing each other. On this particular day, the mood was not good. At the center of the chamber, on the wide speaker's platform, stood the representative of the Vrethkai Dominion. His name was Grath-Ul, and he called himself Magnificent. He had chosen that title himself years ago and had forced every member of his staff to use it. He was tall, with dark blue skin and a wide chest, and he wore a coat covered in military decorations that he had mostly awarded himself. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked out at the assembled representatives with the calm expression of someone who had already decided how things were going to go. He had come to the conclave with a request. Now he wanted rights to expand his dominion's territory into Sector 7 Omega. It was a large stretch of space. It contained good star systems, rich asteroid belts, useful gas giants. The Vrethkai needed room, he said. His people were growing. Their current territory could not support them forever. He spoke for a long time and used many important-sounding words. He talked about the natural rights of growing civilizations. He talked about fairness and progress. He smiled often. Most of the chamber listened in uncomfortable silence. When Grath-Ul finished, there was a pause. Then a figure rose from a seat near the top of the chamber. The figure moved slowly, as if each step cost something. It was old, visibly, unmistakably old. Its skin was pale gold and paper-thin, and its eyes were a deep, solid white with no pupil. It was an Aurelian. There were only 11 Aurelians left in the known universe. They were the oldest living species anyone had ever found, and they almost never spoke in the conclave. When they did, the room went completely quiet. This one's name had no translation in most languages. Representatives called it Elder. Elder walked to the speaker's platform and stood next to Grath-Ul without looking at him. It looked out at the chamber instead, and when it spoke, its voice was low and steady. Sector 7 Omega, Elder said, is not available. Grath-Ul turned to look at it. It is unregistered space, he said. The charts show no claimed territory. The charts, Elder said, are incomplete by design. It paused. The third planet of the Sol system in that sector is inhabited. The species there is called humanity. They are not registered in open conclave records because registration would attract attention. We do not want attention brought to that region. Grath-Ul smiled slowly. Humanity. He let the words sit in the air like something small and harmless. I have seen their energy signatures. Their technology is primitive. They have not yet mastered stable long-range travel. They fight each other constantly over pieces of their own single planet. They are, by any reasonable measure, not a threat. Elder looked at him for the first time. That is what the Cathosi said. The chamber went very still. The Cathosi hegemony had been a powerful civilization once. They had controlled 40 star systems and had a fleet that made other species nervous. 300 years ago, they had pushed into the outer edge of Sector 7 Omega. They had sent a scouting force first, 20 ships, and when those ships did not return, they assumed a navigational accident and sent their main force. 40 warships, full military grade. Their admiral had transmitted a confident message to the conclave before entering the restricted zone. He said they were going to investigate the disappearance of the scouts and, if necessary, deal with whatever primitive resistance they found. No one ever heard from the Cathosi fleet again. The conclave had sent its own investigation team 6 months later. They found debris fields spread across a wide area near Saturn's rings. The wreckage was Cathosi, all of it. There was no human wreckage. There were no bodies, there was no message, no warning, no declaration of victory. The humans had simply erased the Cathosi fleet and gone back to whatever they had been doing before. The Conclave sealed the records. They quietly reclassified Sol as a restricted zone. They never told the Cathosi survivors what really happened, letting them believe their fleet was lost to some natural disaster. They never told anyone, because they did not know what to say. They did not understand what humanity had done, or how, or with what. The data from the debris told them almost nothing useful. The only thing they knew was that something in that sector was extraordinarily dangerous. The Cathosi were warned, Elder said now, standing on the platform in front of Grathul. They did not listen. 83,000 Cathosi soldiers died in 11 minutes. We know the time because the distress signal from their last ship lasted exactly that long before it cut off. Since then, no registered civilization has attempted to enter Sector 7 Omega. That record has held for 3 centuries. It has held for a reason. Grathul was still smiling, but it looked more stiff now. With respect, he said, that is an old story. Stories grow. The Cathosi fleet may have been destroyed by something else entirely, a natural hazard, an unknown phenomenon. You are asking me to avoid a large and valuable sector of space because of an incident 300 years ago that nobody fully understands. Yes, Elder said simply. That is exactly what I'm asking. Grathul turned back to the chamber. He spread his hands wide and addressed the other representatives. You see what happens here, he said, his voice loud and easy. The elder species have built a mythology around a patch of space to keep younger civilizations from developing there. They call it dangerous. They say it is forbidden, but they offer no proof, no recent data, no scientific basis. Only a story about a fleet that disappeared 300 years ago. He shook his head. The Vrethkai Dominion is not afraid of old stories. From the upper seats, a few junior representatives shifted uncomfortably. Some of them came from young civilizations that admired the Vrethkai's boldness. Some of them were impressed by Grathul's confidence. Elder did not argue further. It simply turned and walked back to its seat with the same slow, careful steps. Before sitting down, it said one more thing, without raising its voice, without turning around. You have been told. What you do with that is your own choice, but know that you cannot undo it once it is done. The Conclave voted on the Vrethkai expansion request. By the rules of the Chamber, the Conclave could only advise, not force. Grathul knew this. He had read the charter carefully before coming. The advisory vote against expansion passed easily. 164 votes against, with many abstentions from species too frightened to be seen opposing the Vrethkai directly. But an advisory was not a law. Grathul accepted the vote with a gracious nod and announced that the Vrethkai Dominion respected the Conclave's opinion and would, of course, take it under deep consideration. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. 2 weeks later, the Vrethkai Dominion formally announced the Grand Reclamation Fleet. It was the largest military force the Dominion had ever assembled. 12,000 warships, over 4 million crew members. They had been building toward this for years, not just for Sector 7 Omega, but for the general expansion that Grathul had always planned. Sector 7 Omega was simply the next step. He had chosen it deliberately. He wanted to show the Conclave that their advisories meant nothing. He wanted to prove that the Forbidden Zone was a fiction. After he walked through it unopposed, every other species in the galaxy would understand that the Vrethkai could go wherever they chose. When news of the fleet announcement reached the Conclave chamber, the reaction was not anger. It was something quieter than that. Several elder species began making calls to their home systems. The Aurelians made no public statement. But 3 days after the announcement, Conclave observers noticed that the Aurelian delegation had quietly relocated its office from the central district of the station to a section near the outer docking bays. They were moving closer to the exits. One of the younger representatives, a diplomat from a species called the Seven, who had only joined the Conclave 40 years ago, noticed this and approached the Aurelian elder in the corridor outside the main hall. The Savan diplomat was curious and not yet old enough to understand that some questions were better left unasked. Elder, she said, why are you moving your office? Do you truly believe the Vrethkai fleet is in danger? Elder stopped walking. It considered the question for a moment. The Vrethkai believe they are going to conquer a primitive world, it said. None they have looked at humanity's visible technology and decided it is weak. They have looked at humanity's size and decided it is small. They have read the surface of the situation and decided they understand it. It began walking again. Humanity has been watching the galaxy for a very long time. They have watched every war. They have watched how every fleet fights. They have watched what weapons work and what weapons fail. They have been completely silent the entire time. It paused at the door to the docking bay corridor. A species that says nothing for centuries is not a species that has nothing to say. It is a species that is waiting for the right moment. It looked back at the Saban diplomat one last time. When that moment comes, I do not want to be nearby. The door slid closed behind it. In the main chamber, Han Grathel was giving another speech. He was talking about destiny and greatness, and the courage to move where others feared. He used the word magnificent 3 times in reference to himself. The chamber listened. Some applauded. In the quiet corridor outside, the Aurelians kept packing. Far away at the very edge of the solar system, in the cold dark between the stars, something woke up. It was not dramatic. There was no sound. There was no light. A small, automated station, buried inside a rock the size of a house, received a routine check-in signal from Earth. It processed the signal. It ran a sweep of the surrounding space. Its sensors registered something new, a faint trace of compressed drive signatures at extreme range, moving in a direction they should not have been moving. The station logged the data. It flagged it as priority. It sent a tight beam pulse inward, toward the sun, toward the small blue world third from it. The pulse said, "They are coming." On that blue world, in a building that did not appear on any public map, a light turned on in a room deep underground. A woman sitting at a desk looked at the readout on her screen. She read it carefully. She set down her coffee. She picked up a communications device and entered a code that had not been entered in a very long time. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had been expecting this for years. The year was 2387, and Earth looked almost the same as it always had from space. Almost. If you looked carefully at the night side of the planet, you could see that the lights were different. Cities still glowed in their familiar patterns. But there were new clusters now. Structured, grid-like arrangements that did not follow coastlines or rivers or the old paths of human civilization. These were the industrial zones, the manufacturing rings, the quiet engines of a species that had spent 3.5 centuries building things it hoped never to use. The moon had a gray smear near its southern pole, a base that housed 40,000 people and equipment that officially did not exist. Mars was green in 3 small valleys where atmospheric processors had been running for 80 years, and under its red surface there were tunnels that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, filled with machines and soldiers and enough stored material to fight a war for a decade without resupply from Earth. Europa had a city under its ice. Titan had a city under its sand. Every major moon in the solar system had something human inside it, and most of those things were not on any map that had ever been shared with the outside universe. Humanity had discovered quite early in its observation of the galaxy that the universe was not kind to the naive. The moment humanity had built its first functional deep space antenna, back in 2089, it had started listening. What it heard in the first 50 years of listening was enough to completely change the direction of human civilization. They heard war, they heard conquest, they heard species begging for mercy and other species ignoring those pleas. They heard the galactic conclave discuss, in polished diplomatic language, the acceptable losses involved in containing a plague on a populated world. They heard the Vrethkai, young and aggressive even then, celebrating the destruction of a species called the Mavari, who had simply been in the way of their expansion. The leaders of Earth had sat with all of this information and made a decision that was very hard but very clear. Humanity would not announce itself. It would not join the conclave. It would not wave at the galaxy and say hello and hope for the best. Instead, it would watch and learn and build and wait. It would become very strong, very quietly. And if the day came when the galaxy brought its violence to humanity's door, humanity would be ready. This plan had a name. It was called the Quiet Protocol. Under the Quiet Protocol, humanity's energy signatures were carefully managed. Their communications were tightly encrypted and deliberately scattered to look like background noise. Their off-world structures were built deep underground or inside existing natural formations. Their ships, and they had many ships, ran in electronic silence during any operation that took them near the outer solar system. From the outside, if you were a species scanning the Sol system with standard-grade sensors, you would see a mildly developed world with some orbital infrastructure and basic interplanetary capability. You would file it as pre-contact primitive. You would move on. This was exactly what humanity intended. Admiral Yeva Marchetti had been running Sol Defense Command for 9 years. She was 54 years old with short gray hair and the kind of calm that comes not from a lack of emotion, but from having spent so long in a high-pressure job that the pressure had simply become the baseline. She did not raise her voice. She did not make dramatic speeches. She communicated in short, precise sentences and expected the same in return. Her staff were afraid of her, but it was a respectful fear, the kind people feel for someone who is almost always right. When the alert came in from the Heliopause Sentinel Station, the automated monitoring outpost buried in the rock at the edge of the solar system, she was already awake. She had been awake for 18 hours because 2 days earlier, a different monitoring station, this one in the Oort cloud, had picked up unusual drive trail traces. She had flagged it then. She had begun quiet preparations then. She had not told the civilian government yet because there was nothing confirmed to tell. She believed in delivering confirmed facts, not worries. Now there were confirmed facts. 50 Frethkai vessels had crossed into the Oort cloud. They were moving at a steady, confident pace. No stealth, no caution, no attempt to hide their approach. They were flying in tight formation with running lights on, like a group of soldiers walking down a street in a city they thought they owned. Their drive signatures matched the Vrethkai fleet profiles that Sol Defense Command had been quietly building in its database for the past 40 years. Every energy output, every engine cycle, every communication frequency, all of it had been cataloged and studied. Humanity knew the Vrethkai's technology extremely well. The Vrethkai knew nothing about humanity's. Marchetti looked at the display for a long moment. Then she entered the code for Contact Protocol 1 and walked to the communications room. Contact Protocol 1 was simple. It called for a single human diplomatic vessel to intercept the approaching force and issue a formal warning. The vessel used for this purpose was the ISV Meridian Star, a small, lightly armed ship that looked, to outside sensors, like a basic interplanetary shuttle with some upgraded communications gear. It looked harmless. It was not harmless. It carried, among other things, a passive intelligence package that could record every signal, scan every system, and map every vessel in a fleet from 40,000 kilometers away without leaving any detectable trace. But none of that would be visible to the Vrethkai. The Meridian Star intercepted the Vrethkai scouts near the outer edge of the Oort cloud. Its crew of 6 operated with practiced ease. The communications officer sent the advisory broadcast on 17 frequencies simultaneously in 14 languages. The Vrethkai's own language was first. The message was as follows: "You are approaching a restricted sovereign zone under the authority of the Sol System Governing Council. Entry beyond this point constitutes an act of territorial violation. This is your first and only advisory. You are strongly encouraged to turn back. If you continue, the consequences will be your own responsibility." The message was polite. It was clear. It was sent 4 times over the course of 40 minutes with no answer. Then a reply came. Grathol's voice filled the Meridian Star's communications room. He sounded amused. "Primitive vessel," he said. "You are speaking to the Grand Reclamation Fleet of the Vrethkai Dominion. Now, we are 12,000 warships strong. We act under the authority of Grathul the Magnificent, Admiral of the Dominion, Conqueror of 14 worlds." There was a pause, as if he was enjoying the sound of his own credentials. "Your warning is noted and rejected. You will stand aside. If you comply immediately and do not interfere with our operations, you will be cataloged as a low-priority population and processed efficiently. Resistance will result in your complete destruction. You have 5 of your minutes to move your vessel." On the bridge of the Meridian Star, The communications officer looked at the captain. The captain looked at the message log for a moment. His expression did not change. He nodded once. The communications officer opened a broadband channel. Not just a local frequency, but a signal powerful enough to reach every ship in the Vrethkai fleet and every monitoring station in the solar system, and, if aimed correctly, powerful enough to reach the Galactic Conclave's communication relays. It was aimed correctly. Everything the Meridian Star did in the next 30 seconds was recorded and transmitted outward in all directions. The captain spoke clearly and without any emotion. Vrethkai fleet, this is the Sol System vessel Meridian Star. You have received your advisory. You have declined it. This transmission is being recorded and broadcast to all receiving parties. What follows is not a declaration of war. It is not aggression. It is not a threat. It is a statement of consequence. You have chosen to enter sovereign space after a clear warning. The results of that choice belong entirely to you, where we will not be contacting you again. He paused for exactly 1 second. You were warned. The Galactic Conclave received the transmission 14 minutes later, delayed by the distance the signal had to travel. When it arrived, the main chamber was in the middle of a routine agricultural dispute between two mid-tier species. The dispute stopped immediately. Representatives from a dozen different civilizations pulled up the transmission and played it twice. Some of them recognized the broadband signature. It was enormous, far more powerful than a basic diplomatic vessel should have been able to generate. The signal clarity was perfect. The encoding was layered with a level of technical sophistication that did not match the apparent capabilities of the vessel it had come from. In the Aurelian section of the station, an elder was already standing when an aide brought the message. It listened. It said nothing. It turned to its small group of staff and said simply, "Accelerate the packing. We leave within the hour." In the conclave chamber, a mid-tier diplomat from a species called the Rathian stood up and asked loudly whether anyone should attempt to contact the Vrethkai fleet and urged them to stop. Several other representatives agreed this was a good idea. A response team was assembled. Messages were sent. None of them reached the Vrethkai fleet in time to matter. Back in the Oort cloud, the Meridian Star turned around. Its pilot executed a clean, unhurried course back toward the inner system. No speed, no panic. It moved at a pace that suggested it had done what it needed to do and was now simply going home. Hangrath-Ul watched the small vessel retreat on his display and laughed. He turned to his officers on the command bridge and spread his hands wide. 14 civilizations, he said, and not one of them sent a ship this small to meet us. These humans send us a shuttle. He shook his head in amusement. This world is going to be the easiest conquest of my career. His officers laughed with him. On the screens around the bridge, the tactical displays showed the fleet's formation. 12,000 vessels in clean rows. Their drives burning steadily, heading inward toward the dim yellow star at the center of this unremarkable system. Grathol looked at the image of that star and thought about the speech he would give when he reached the third planet. He had given this speech 14 times before. He had it memorized. He liked the part where he listed the worlds he had already taken. It always impressed the populations being conquered. It made them understand the scale of what they were dealing with. It made them give up faster. He did not think about the Meridian Star anymore. It was already forgotten. He did not notice that in the 40 minutes his fleet had spent near that small vessel, every single ship in the Grand Reclamation Fleet had been scanned, mapped, cataloged, and transmitted in complete detail to a command center buried under the surface of the fourth planet in this system. He did not know that as his fleet moved toward Neptune's orbit, the temperature inside 1,000 dormant installations across the solar system was rising, very slowly as power cores came online for the first time in years. He did not know that 40 warships in Earth orbit, ships that had never appeared on any sensor his fleet carried, had just received a short message from Sol Defense Command that contained only 2 words. Stand ready. The Vrethkai fleet crossed Neptune's orbit on a Tuesday. No one on Neptune's research station saw it happen. Because the research station did not exist as far as the Vrethkai sensors were concerned, it was buried under 40 meters of ice and rock on the moon Triton, and its exterior shell was coated in a material that scattered sensor pings in random directions. From outside, the moon looked empty. Inside, a team of 42 scientists and military observers watched the Vrethkai fleet move through their sensor range with the quiet focus of people watching something they had spent years preparing for. The lead observer, a tall man named Dr. Chin, marked the timestamp in the log and sent a compressed data burst back toward the inner system. It arrived at Seoul Defense Command in under 20 minutes. By then, the fleet's position, speed, formation, and updated tactical profile had already been integrated into the main targeting computer. Every Vrethkai ship had a number. Every number had a file. Every file contained the ship's engine output, its shield frequency, its hull composition, its likely crew count, and the specific weapon configuration most effective against it. This information had been built slowly, over decades, by listening. Humanity's deep space monitoring network stretched from the Oort cloud to the Kuiper belt to the outer moons of Neptune and Uranus, and it had been running quietly for nearly 2 centuries. At every Vrethkai military broadcast, every tactical exercise, every fleet maneuver that had ever been transmitted on any frequency had been received, stored, and studied. Humanity knew how the Vrethkai fought. They knew the preferred formation for an assault on a defended planet. They knew the sequence in which Vrethkai commanders issued orders during a battle. They knew which of their ships moved first and which moved last. They knew the exact frequency bands the Vrethkai used for fleet-wide communication and the precise electromagnetic signature that preceded a weapons lock. They had been paying attention for a very long time. On the bridge of his flagship, Grath-Ul was reviewing what his sensors were telling him about the Sol system, and what they were telling him was mostly what he expected. There was a small inhabited world in the third orbital position. There was orbital infrastructure around it. Satellites, some kind of station, a few vessels in low orbit. There was activity on the fourth planet and on several moons, but the energy signatures were low-grade and consistent with early-stage colonization. There was asteroid mining activity in the belt between the fourth and fifth planets. The fifth planet was a gas giant, useful for fuel processing, nothing more. Everything looked small, everything looked manageable, but his sensor officer, Veth Ka, was frowning. Veth Ka was young for her rank, only 32 years old, and she had earned her position by being extremely good at reading data. She had a habit of going deeper into sensor returns than most officers bothered to, while looking past the obvious signals at the background noise underneath. She had once found a hidden listening post on a supposedly empty asteroid by noticing a micro-variation in its albedo. Now, as she worked through the returns from the Sol system, she was noticing things that did not line up cleanly. The asteroids in the belt had mass readings that were slightly off from what their visible size would suggest. Not by much, barely a fraction of a percent, but she noticed. The gas signatures around several of the moons were subtly wrong in ways that could indicate concealed thermal sources, and the fourth planet's surface showed faint, deeply buried electromagnetic signatures that did not match the kind of activity a basic colonial operation would produce. They were too regular, too deliberate. She ran the data twice, then a third time. "Admiral," she said. "Busy," Grath-Ul said, without looking up from the strategic display. "Admiral, I need you to look at something." He turned with an expression that suggested this had better be worth his time. She showed him the anomaly readings. She explained them as clearly as she could. She told him that the mass readings in the asteroid belt were inconsistent with natural formations. She told him about the buried signatures on the fourth planet. She told him that, in her opinion, there might be more to this system than the initial scan suggested. Grath-Ul looked at the data for a moment. Then he looked at the main display, where 12,000 of his ships moved in perfect formation across the outer solar system. He thought about the 14 worlds he had conquered. He thought about how each of those conquests had felt at this stage. The sensor confusion, the strange readings, the junior officers who got nervous and saw threats in shadows. He had learned to trust the big picture over the small details. "Navigation interference," he said. "This system has unusual magnetic fields near the gas giant. It affects deep-range readings. Update your calibration model." He went back to his display. "Continue as planned." Veth Ka said, "Yes, Admiral." She went back to her console. She did not update her calibration model. She kept looking. What was actually happening in the Sol system, while the Vrethkai fleet moved steadily through the outer range, was this. In the asteroid belt, inside a rock called 2103 Delta that appeared on no public chart, a battalion of 1,200 human Marines was running final equipment checks. The rock had been hollowed out over a period of 60 years. It was not a base in any traditional sense. It was a fortress, built inside a natural object that a passing sensor sweep would read as just another chunk of mineral debris. Its weapons were pointed outward. Its crew had been briefed. They were waiting. In the Kuiper Belt, dormant since their last activation test 5 years ago, 4 million autonomous combat drones were waking up. They were small, about the size of a human fist, and they had no propulsion of their own. They moved using magnetic field riding and microburst chemical thrusters, which produced almost no detectable signature. They had been seeded across the outer solar system over the past 100 years, one by one, carried out on resupply missions and released in clusters during routine transit runs. Most of them had been sitting still long enough to accumulate thin coatings of dust and ice, which made them nearly invisible to standard sensors. Their cores were now warming. Their targeting systems were now linking up with the central command network. They were slow to move, but they had enormous range and they could swarm. On Titan, the surface had a landscape of orange hills and chemical lakes that looked the same as it had for billions of years. But 3 of those hills were hollow. Their outer shells were constructed from local materials processed to match Titan's natural composition precisely. Inside each one was a launch array, a long series of electromagnetic accelerators pointed at a carefully calculated section of sky. Whilst the arrays had been built over 80 years, mostly by robotic construction teams, and they had never fired a live round. They had run simulations 10,000 times. The engineering team had been running final checks for the past 72 hours and had logged them all green. In Earth orbit, 40 warships sat in absolute silence. They ran no active sensors. They emitted no communications. Their drive systems were fully powered but completely contained, generating no exhaust. They were wrapped in a stealth composite developed 30 years ago by a materials science team in Norway, and they were so good at being invisible that Earth's own civilian air traffic systems did not register them. They had been up there for 6 years, maintained by rotating crews who understood that their job was to wait. They were very good at waiting. More deep under the surface of Mars, in a complex so large that the corridors required electric transport to navigate efficiently, Admiral Marchetti stood in the war room and looked at the most complete tactical display she had ever seen in a real operational context. It covered an entire wall, 12 meters wide, 3 meters tall, and it showed every object of interest in the solar system in real time, updated every 4 seconds by the monitoring network. Every Vrethkai ship was tagged in red. Every human asset was tagged in blue. There were a lot of blue tags. She was standing with 12 other admirals, the full Sol Defense Council. They were drinking coffee and talking in low voices. Some of them looked tense. Marchetti did not look tense. She looked like a surgeon who had spent years studying a patient and was now about to perform the operation she had been preparing for. "They'll pass the belt in approximately 9 hours," said the tactical officer beside her. "At their current speed, they'll reach Jupiter's orbital range in about 31 hours. Marchetti nodded. "Let them reach Jupiter," she said. "Full silent running on all assets. Nothing moves, nothing activates, until I give the word." "We could stop them at the belt," one of the other admirals said. "Cleaner. Less risk of debris reaching the inner system." "We're stopping them at Jupiter," Marchetti said. "I want them far enough in that there's no running back, and I want every asset in position and confirmed ready before we go. No rushing." She turned back to the display. On it, the red dots of the Vrethkai fleet crept slowly inward, unaware that 12 layers of response were arranged around them in complete silence. In the conclave, a mid-tier diplomat had been trying for 18 hours to reach the Vrethkai command ship with a message urging caution. She had sent the message 11 times. She had received no response. She was now standing in the corridor outside the Aurelian section of the station, trying to find Elder, because she had the unsettling feeling that she was missing something important, and Elder would know what it was. She found Elder in the docking bay, already aboard a small transport vessel, staff moving efficiently around it. The bay smelled of fuel and cold metal. "Elder," she said, "can you tell me something? Why are the humans doing nothing? The Vrethkai fleet is passing Neptune. Why hasn't there been any response? No military movement, no communications, nothing. Is it possible the humans actually can't respond? Is it possible they really are as primitive as the Vrethkai believe? Elder looked at her from the top of the boarding ramp. It was quiet for a moment. Have you ever watched a very large, very patient animal wait for prey? It said. She hesitated. Yes. When the prey is close enough, Elder said, and the moment is right, the animal does not growl first. It does not give a warning. It simply acts. The waiting is not weakness. The silence is not absence. It stepped back onto the ramp. The humans have not responded because they are not reacting. They have been ready for this moment for a very long time. What you are watching right now is the last few seconds before a strike that has been planned for decades. The docking bay doors began to close. Elder's transport detached from the station without another word. The diplomat stood in the empty bay for a long moment. Then she walked quickly back to the communications room to try once more to reach the Vrethkai fleet. In the cold dark between Jupiter and the asteroid belt, 4 million small patient drones finished their startup cycles. Their targeting matrices synced with the command network. Their engagement protocols loaded. They drifted quietly in the dark, separated by thousands of kilometers, invisible, motionless, and completely ready. They waited for the word that they knew was coming. Everything waited. Grathul had given his conquest speech 14 times. He knew it the way a performer knows a song they have played for years. Not just the words, but the rhythm of it, the pauses, the moments where he let the silence stretch before saying the next thing. He had refined it over the years. The early version had been too long. The current version was exactly 22 minutes, and it covered his credentials, the history of the Vrethkai Dominion, a brief summary of the 14 worlds already under his authority, and a clear explanation of what the people of the target world could expect if they cooperated versus if they did not. It ended with the phrase that he had come to think of as his signature line: "The galaxy bends to those with the will to shape it." He was 14 minutes into the speech when the lights went out. Not on his flagship, not in any physical sense. The lights went out in the electromagnetic sense. Every single piece of active sensor equipment on his command ship suddenly stopped receiving useful data and began receiving noise. Not jamming exactly. It was more like every frequency his sensors used had been filled with a carefully generated static that was just real-looking enough to be confusing. His crew spent the first 30 seconds trying to recalibrate. They spent the next 30 seconds realizing the recalibration was not working. In that single minute, every command officer on the flagship went from confident to deeply uncertain. Then Vethka's voice came over the internal channel, and it was not the voice of someone reporting routine data. It was the voice of someone who had spent the last 31 hours telling herself she was wrong and had just found out she was right. "Admiral," she said, "they're here." On the main display, the one that was still working, barely, with degraded resolution, shapes were appearing, not from one direction, from all directions, from the asteroids, from the moons, from the dark space between objects where there should have been nothing at all. Large shapes and medium shapes and tens of thousands of small shapes, all moving inward simultaneously in a geometry that made it immediately obvious to anyone with tactical training that this was not a reactive response. This was a prepared one. Every vector was too precise. Every approach angle was too perfectly coordinated. This had been planned with exact knowledge of where every Vrethkai ship would be at this moment. Grathul stepped toward the display. The speech was forgotten. It would never be finished. "Oh, how many?" he asked. Vethka's hands were moving fast across her console. "I can't get a clean count. The small objects, they're in the millions. The large, I'm reading at least 40 capital class. There are structures in the asteroid belt that weren't there before, or," she paused, "they were always there. We just couldn't see them." She looked up. Her face was a color Vrethkai faces did not normally go. "Admiral, they've been hiding. Everything we saw coming in, everything that looked empty, it wasn't." He had not even finished processing that when the first strike came. It did not come as a wave. It did not come with any buildup or warning signal. One moment the Vrethkai destroyer VKS Harith was moving in formation at the fleet's left flank, and the next moment it was not there anymore. And there was a brief flash, Not a bright one, just a quick pulse of light. And then the Harith was debris. The strike had been so fast and so precise that the ship next to it barely had time to register the event before the same thing happened to it. And then it happened to the ship next to that one, not one at a time. Within the first 40 seconds of the engagement, 60 Vrethkai ships were destroyed. They were not destroyed in clusters or in lines. They were picked off individually, each one targeted by a different weapon system from a different direction, as though 12,000 separate marksmen had each been assigned a single target and told to fire simultaneously. The precision was not the precision of overwhelming firepower. It was the precision of a system that knew exactly where every ship was, exactly how its shields worked, and exactly where to hit it to end it fastest. Grethel screamed for defensive formation. His communications officer tried to broadcast the order. The fleet communication channels were jammed, not completely but selectively. The command frequencies were full of noise. The emergency frequencies were partially functional. Units were receiving fragmented orders and responding with confusion. The Vrethkai had trained for disrupted communications. They had drills for it, but those drills assumed the disruption would be partial and temporary, and that the fleet would be able to fall back on local unit command until comms were restored. What was happening now was different. The local unit commanders could not fall back on local command because they were each dealing with simultaneous threats from multiple directions. There was no zone that was safe. There was no direction to retreat toward. The attack was coming from everywhere at the same pitch, in the same intensity, which meant that there was no weak spot in the perimeter. There was no perimeter. On the hull of asteroid 2103 Delta, the Fortress Bay doors had opened, and the Marine Battalion inside was providing direct fire support to the drones operating in the belt. The Marines were not the main weapon. They were the cleanup element, assigned to deal with any Vrethkai ships that tried to use the belt's cover to hide from the drone swarm. So far, 2 Vrethkai destroyers had tried this. They were gone now. In orbit around Jupiter, the 40 human capital ships had dropped their stealth the moment the engagement began. They lit up, drive trails burning, weapons hot, and moved in tight formation toward the densest concentration of the Vrethkai fleet. They were big ships, built over decades in underground orbital facilities, and they moved with a quiet authority that was different from the frantic energy of the Vrethkai ships scrambling around them. The Vrethkai tried to target them. 12 ships redirected fire toward the human capital group. The weapons hit. They hit the shields, which were not the shields any of the Vrethkai fire control systems had been designed to penetrate, because those systems had been calibrated based on old data from the Cathasi incident, which was the only time the Vrethkai had any record of confronting human technology. The human shields in 2038 were not the human shields of 2087. The weapons fire scattered. The capital ships kept moving. On Titan, the launch arrays fired for the first time. The engineers who had built those arrays had spent 80 years designing them and never heard them operate at full power. The sound, contained within Titan's surface, not audible in space, was later described by the crew inside as something between a thunderclap and a physical impact, a vibration that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. The projectiles they fired were not traditional explosives. They were dense-core kinetic impactors, shaped to maintain velocity across enormous distances, and they had been aimed at the outer edge of the Vrethkai formation, the ships hanging back in reserve, the command vessels, the fleet carriers that held the fighter craft that the Vrethkai had been planning to deploy against a planet's surface defenses. Those carriers never deployed their fighters. In the war room on Mars, Marchetti watched the display. The blue tags moved smoothly. The red tags were going out one by one, quickly but not chaotically. The engagement was tracking almost exactly to the projected models her team had built over the past decade of planning. She was not cheering. None of the 12 admirals were cheering. They were working, monitoring asset status, tracking ammunition usage, watching for anything unexpected. The room was quiet except for clipped technical exchanges and the steady soft sound of the ventilation system. Capital Group is past the halfway point, the tactical officer reported. We drone swarm at 72% engagement coverage. Belt assets holding. Titan arrays confirmed second salvo complete. Losses? Marchetti asked. The tactical officer checked. None confirmed. She nodded and kept watching. 6 minutes into the battle, Grathol managed to get a partial communication channel open to 3 of his fleet commanders. He ordered them to consolidate their remaining ships and push through toward the inner system. His logic was that the humans' weapons were concentrated in the outer system, and if the fleet could break through to the inner planets, they might find a gap in the coverage. It was not a bad instinct. It was the kind of aggressive forward push that had worked for him before, but the humans had planned for it. The inner system was not undefended. It was where the secondary systems were, the ones that hadn't fired yet. The lunar base on Earth's moon had weapons that had not been activated. The orbital defense network around Earth itself, which looked like a satellite constellation to anyone scanning from outside, was something very different up close. And the 40 capital ships were not following the Vrethkai ships trying to push inward. They were moving to cut them off. Of the 1,200 ships that attempted the inner system push, 316 made it past Jupiter's orbital range. They did not make it significantly further. At the 9-minute mark, Grath-Ul's flagship took its first hit. It was not destroyed. The strike was precise and intentional, targeting the drive assembly specifically, disabling the ship's ability to maneuver without destroying it outright. He understood immediately that it was deliberate. They were not killing him yet. They were trapping him. A communication came through on a frequency his team had not been using. A clean, clear signal that cut through all the noise. Grath-Ul. Admiral Marchetti's voice was calm and unhurried. You have approximately 2 minutes before we complete the engagement with your remaining mobile vessels. At that point, your flagship will be the only functional Vrethkai ship in this system. I am giving you those 2 minutes to make whatever recordings or transmissions you feel are necessary. A pause. You were warned. The channel closed. Grathol stood on his bridge and looked at his display. The red tags, his ships, his fleet, 4 million people he had commanded, were going dark in clusters now. Not because the battle had accelerated, but because there were fewer and fewer left to track. The display that had shown 12,000 vessels in clean formation an hour ago now showed hundreds, then fewer than 100. The numbers dropped with a cold, metronomic regularity that was worse than chaos would have been. Chaos would have meant randomness. This meant that every death was chosen, targeted, deliberate. He tried to open a conclave channel. He got through. He was screaming by then, not the loud, confident voice that filled chambers and gave speeches. Something smaller. Help us, he said. Conclave intervention. We are being destroyed. 12,000 ships. All of them. Send help. The conclave chamber received the signal. What representatives watched on their screens. No one moved to intervene. Some of them looked away. The Rathian diplomat who had been trying to reach the Vrethkai for days sat in her seat and stared at the transmission with an expression that was not satisfaction, but something closer to grief. Grief for the loss of life, grief for the arrogance that had made it inevitable. At 11 minutes and 7 seconds after the engagement began, the last mobile Vrethkai vessel in the Sol system was destroyed. 212 ships had attempted to flee back toward the Oort cloud. They were not fast enough. The drone swarm had been assigned a pursuit vector from the moment the retreat began, and the drones were patient and thorough. The humans' doctrine, written after the Cathosai incident, debated for decades, ultimately agreed upon by every Sol Defense Council in the 3 centuries since, was absolute. No vessel that entered sovereign Sol space in aggression was permitted to return to hostile territory with intelligence about Sol's capabilities. The last drone pursuit ended 47 minutes after the main battle, far out in the Kuiper Belt in complete silence. Total Vrethkai fleet, 12,000 ships, 4.2 million crew members. Time of engagement from first strike to last pursuit, 58 minutes and 23 seconds. Human casualties, 0. In the war room, when the final confirmation came through, Marchetti set down her coffee cup. She looked at the display for a moment. Then she looked at the 12 admirals around her. They looked back at her. No one celebrated. No one raised a fist. Several of them nodded slowly, which was as much as any of them had. Then they began the work of post-engagement assessment, documenting what had been used, what had worked, what might be refined. There was already a report to write and a solar system to clean up. The Galactic Conclave did not convene an emergency session immediately. It convened many things immediately. Private communications between delegations, urgent calls back to home systems, a dozen simultaneous closed-door meetings that ran through the night cycle of the station's artificial clock. But the full chamber session did not happen until 2 days after the battle in Seoul, because the first day was spent in something that had no formal name in conclave procedure. It was spent in stunned silence. Civilizations that had been dealing with galactic politics for thousands of years found themselves sitting very quietly and thinking very carefully about what they had just watched. When the session did open, it was different from other sessions. Normally, representatives argued. Normally, there were long speeches and points of order and diplomatic language wrapped around barely hidden threats. This session was quieter. People spoke carefully. Nobody wanted to say the wrong thing, because for the first time in a very long time, the chamber had been reminded, in extremely clear terms, that there was something in the galaxy more dangerous than any of the civilizations currently sitting in this room. The first item formally raised was a motion to reclassify humanity's official status in conclave records. For 3 centuries, and the Sol system had been listed under a bureaucratic category that translated roughly as uncontacted developing world, restricted access. Several species now argued that this classification was no longer accurate or appropriate. A developing world did not destroy 12,000 warships in under an hour without losing a single vessel. A developing world did not have 4 million autonomous combat drones seeded across its outer solar system. A developing world did not run a centuries-long silent intelligence operation against every major military power in the galaxy. The motion to reclassify humanity as a sovereign power, a full, independent, recognized civilization with the same formal standing as any of the elder species, passed unanimously. It passed in 11 minutes, which was the fastest vote on any major motion in conclave history by a margin of several hours. There was one abstention. The Aurelian delegation did not vote because the Aurelian delegation was not present. They had left before the battle. But they sent a written statement that was read into the record. It was short. It said, "This reclassification is overdue by approximately 3 centuries. We trust the chamber will govern itself accordingly going forward." The second item was harder. The conclave needed to send a formal diplomatic delegation to Earth. This was necessary for a dozen procedural reasons, but it was also, everyone understood, a political act. A public acknowledgement that humanity was now a power that the conclave respected and intended to treat as an equal. Finding volunteers for the delegation was surprisingly difficult, not because anyone wanted to be hostile to humanity, but because nobody was entirely sure what the interaction would be like. They had just watched humanity erase a fleet of 12,000 ships with the calm efficiency of someone doing a routine maintenance task. The idea of walking up to these people and making small talk was, for many species, slightly terrifying. Eventually, a delegation of 7 was assembled, led by Conclave Secretary Orith, a calm and experienced diplomat from a species called the Venethi. Orith had been in diplomacy for 40 years and claimed to have seen everything. After watching the Sol engagement on the chamber screens, he privately revised this assessment, but he was professional and he went. And the delegation traveled to Earth Station Meridian, a large orbital facility above the planet that the humans had apparently been using as a coordination center. They were met at the docking bay by a small group of humans in plain military uniforms. No ceremony, no honor guard, no grand entrance hall lined with decorations. Just a corridor, a meeting room, and Admiral Yeva Marchetti sitting at one end of a table with a cup of coffee and a small data tablet. She stood when they entered. She shook hands with each of them, a human contact greeting that most of the delegation had read about but never experienced. Her grip was firm. Her expression was professional and not unfriendly. She gestured for them to sit. Orath had prepared remarks. He delivered them carefully. The conclave's formal recognition of humanity's sovereign status, the acknowledgement of Sol system territorial rights, the assurances of non-aggression from all conclave member civilizations. He kept the language clean and direct, avoiding the elaborate diplomatic constructions that conclave sessions usually required. He had a feeling this woman would not have much patience for that. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded. Thank you, she said. We accept the recognition. There was a pause. Orath looked at her. Admiral, he said carefully, may I ask you something? Your civilization has had the capability to engage with the Conclave for, we now understand, a very long time. You chose not to. Why? Marchetti looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the table, then back at him. Ina, we listened to what was happening out there for about 150 years before we made any decisions, she said. What we heard was not encouraging. We saw what happened to species that announced themselves before they were ready. We saw what happened to species that looked weak. We saw what happened to species that looked strong, but had made enemies they didn't know about. We decided the best option was to be ready before we were visible. She picked up her coffee. We hoped to never be visible at all, honestly. We hoped everyone would just leave us alone. But the Vrethkai did not leave you alone, Orath said. No, she said. They did not. She said it without anger, without satisfaction. It was a plain statement of fact, the way you might note that it had rained yesterday. What happens now? Orath asked. With the Vrethkai, their homeworld, their remaining systems, they are now without a military. Without the fleet, they have no defensive capacity. Some Conclave members have raised the question of whether the Vrethkai civilian population is now at risk from other aggressive civilizations, who might see an opportunity. Marchetti was quiet for a moment. That's a Conclave problem, she said. We destroyed their fleet because it entered our space after a warning. We have no interest in their homeworld. We have no interest in their civilian population. We are not conquerors. She set the coffee down. Make sure your members understand that. We acted in defense of sovereign territory. That's the beginning and end of it. Orath nodded slowly. He believed her. He was not sure whether that made it better or more frightening, but he believed her. After the delegation left, Marchetti sat alone in the meeting room for a few minutes. Outside the room's viewport, the curve of the earth was visible, brown and blue and white, clouds moving in slow spirals over the ocean. She had spent most of her career underground, in war rooms on Mars, and in bunkers on Earth, and she did not often have reason to be in orbital stations. She looked at the planet for a while. Then she picked up her tablet and went back to work. Far from the Sol system, in a part of the galaxy that the Vrethkai had once called home territory, a young woman named Sila sat in a small apartment in a city on the Vrethkai homeworld. She was 19 years old. She worked in a fabric manufacturing shop during the day and studied engineering in the evenings. She had known in a distant way that her government was sending a fleet somewhere. The news channels had talked about it as a great expansion, a historic moment, a demonstration of Vrethkai power. The news channels had stopped talking about it 11 days ago. There had been no official announcement from the government. There had been no update, no statement, no confirmation of anything. Just silence, and then slowly the kind of quiet information leak that governments cannot fully suppress. Rumors at first, then whispered numbers, then a gradual collective understanding settling over the population like a cold fog. The fleet was gone, all of it. 4 million people were not coming home. Sila's older brother had been on one of those ships. She had not cried yet. She was not sure she had fully understood it yet. She sat at her kitchen table with a small portable screen in front of her, and on that screen she had found a recording, one of the last transmissions from the fleet, picked up by a monitoring satellite and circulated quietly through restricted data channels until it found its way to the general public. It was the transmission from the human vessel Meridian Star, the one that had gone out on broadband before the fleet reached the inner system. She had listened to it 3 times. She listened to the calm voice of the human captain. She listened to the words. She listened to the final phrase, "You were warned." She sat with it for a long time. She thought about her brother, who had laughed at the dinner table 2 months ago and called this expedition an easy victory, and said he would be home by the end of the season. She thought about the 14 worlds the Vrethkai had already conquered, the populations that lived under Vrethkai authority now, the way her civilization had always talked about expansion as natural and right and necessary. She thought about the moment when the fleet commander had received a warning from a small ship and laughed. She looked out her window at the night sky. The stars looked the same as they always had, distant and cold and very, very numerous. She had grown up thinking of them as places to go, future territory, future resources, future glory for her people. Now they looked different. Now there was a star out there, one of those tiny lights that had a planet around it where something lived. Something that had watched the galaxy for centuries without speaking. Something that had built defenses so thorough that 12,000 warships had not been enough to even scratch them. Something that had been warned and then waited patiently for the warning to be refused, and then acted with a speed and completeness that left no room for doubt about what it was capable of. She did not know which star it was. That was, she understood slowly, exactly the point. In the conclave station, Elder returned 2 weeks after the battle. It came back quietly as it did everything. No announcement, no ceremony, just a transport docking and a small group of pale gold figures moving through the corridor to their offices, which had been moved back from the docking bay to the central district again. A junior Aurelian aide asked Elder whether it was surprised by what had happened. Or whether it had expected the battle to end so completely and so quickly. Elder considered this. No, it said. I was not surprised. I was watching what I expected to watch. When did you first realize humanity was this powerful? The aide asked. I did not realize it, Elder said. I suspected it when I first read the records of the Cathosi incident 300 years ago. The Cathosi fleet did not simply disappear. It was eliminated with a precision that told me the humans had planned for exactly that kind of incursion. A young species reacts to an attack. An experienced species prepares for one. It paused. I spent many years after that incident watching humanity's energy patterns. They were almost perfectly controlled. Almost, but not quite. Well, you cannot hide everything from someone who is looking very carefully. It continued down the corridor. What I saw was patience. Patience on a scale most civilizations cannot manage. They were afraid, not of losing a battle, but of being seen before they were ready. That kind of fear, disciplined and directed, is not weakness. It is strategy. The aide was quiet for a moment. What do we do now? How does the conclave deal with humanity going forward? Elder stopped at the door of its office. It turned and looked at the aide. Respectfully, it said, and honestly, and without assuming that because they did not speak, they were not listening. It opened the door. Everything the conclave has said for the last 300 years, humanity heard. They know what we said about them. They know who warned them and who did not. They know who was afraid and who was not. Elder stepped inside. We start from that truth and we proceed carefully. The door closed. In the galaxy, word spread. It always does. The conclave's formal recognition of humanity as a sovereign power went out through diplomatic channels, but the story of the battle traveled faster than official channels, carried by traders and travelers in the kind of informal communication networks that no government can fully control. It reached young civilizations just beginning to develop space travel. It reached old civilizations reconsidering their territorial ambitions. It reached aggressive species who had been looking at nearby systems with hungry eyes and who were now, very quietly, updating their threat assessments. The forbidden zone around Seoul was not reduced, it was expanded. Not by human demand, by mutual, unspoken agreement, because the galaxy had learned something. Not about human weapons, though those were clearly extraordinary. Not about human strategy, though that was clearly sophisticated. The galaxy had learned something simpler and more important than either of those things. Humanity did not conquer. It did not expand by force. It did not seek territory it hadn't already claimed. It had spent 3 centuries building the ability to destroy, and had used that ability exactly once, against exactly the force that had refused the warning and walked into its home. They had not chased the Vrethkai homeworld. They had not made demands. They had not broadcast their victory or made speeches. They had just won, completely, and then gone back to what they were doing before. And that restraint was more frightening than anything else about them. Because a civilization that builds what humanity had built, and then does not use it for conquest, that civilization is not held back by inability. It is held back by choice, and a choice can change. In a cold room on the Vrethkai homeworld, Sila finally closed the recording. She sat in the silence for a long time. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep for a while. She lay in the dark and thought about how her world had always told her that strength meant taking, that power meant pushing, that greatness meant being the thing others feared. She had believed this. Almost everyone she knew believed it. It was the story of her civilization. But there was another story, a different kind of strength, the kind that waited and prepared and said nothing. And when the moment came, did not roar or celebrate or demand glory, just acted, just finished it, and then went home. She stared at the ceiling. Somewhere out there, past the stars she could not see through the roof of her apartment, past the systems and the void and the cold, dark between everything, there was a small blue world with a yellow sun that had watched the galaxy for 300 years and said nothing. And when it finally spoke, the only word it needed was three. You were warned.